Hello and welcome back to the final video for Philosophy Theme 1 as a part of WJEC Eduqas A-Level Religious Studies. Today we're going to finish looking at the ontological argument by examining its challenges. Now the first challenges we're going to look at are by a man named Gaunilo, and Gaunilo's challenges are put against Anselm's ontological argument, which we talked about in the video entitled 1D, Origins of the ontological argument. So what were Gaunilo's challenges to these arguments? If you're not sure what the arguments were, then definitely go back and watch that video. So, in response to Anselm's Proslogion 2, a French monk known as Gaunilo sent his rebuttal of the ontological argument in a work which he entitled On Behalf of the Fool. Because Gaunilo Anselm starts his argument by quoting Psalm 14:1, which says, "The fool says in his heart, there is no God." So Gaunilo's, even though he does himself believe in God, right, he's a monk, is saying on behalf of the fool. So he's saying, actually, I think you've got some issues with your argument, right? So in his response to Anselm's argument, Gaunilo used a technique known in Latin as reductio ad absurdum. Reductio ad absurdum basically means that you demonstrate the absurdities in someone's reasoning. Okay, you show, well, hang on a minute, if what you're saying is true, then this absurd conclusion follows. And therefore what you're saying is true isn't actually true. Okay, so that's what he's doing. He's saying, hang on a minute, Anselm, I don't think that this logic is really consistent. The way he does that is by presenting a parody of the ontological argument. Okay, parody is like another production of a thing or a replica of it, but using something different to the original. So he's creating like, okay, well, instead of God, let's use a different thing. And the thing he uses is an island. So he's going to apply the logic that Anselm uses to God to an island. So, Gaunilo basically maintains that if Anselm can assert that a perfect being must exist in reality as well as in the mind, then why can you not say the same of a perfect island? Okay, so if God is the perfect being, and to be perfect, he has to exist both in the mind and in reality. Okay, then what about a perfect island? Why doesn't that have to also exist in reality? So basically, the parody is saying that if I have the idea, of the greatest possible island in my mind, right? I might have a certain amount of coconut trees and these beautiful picturesque beaches and glistening water. So I have that idea in my mind of the perfect island. And since it's greater, according to Anselm, to exist in the external world as well as the mind than just the mind, then it follows that this great island, or the greatest island, actually exists. But this is absurd, which means what? That Anselm's logic is actually flawed. Okay? So thus, Gaunilo is objecting to the leap that Anselm makes from the mental realm to the real world, since simply having an idea of a perfect being does not necessitate that this perfect being actually exists, any more than having an idea of a perfect island necessitates its physical existence. And that really is the key point, that for some, totally refutes what Anselm is trying to get at. Okay, so just because I can say that something is perfect, okay, doesn't mean that it exists beyond my mind. Because just because I can think of a perfect island doesn't mean it exists in reality, and just because I can think of a perfect God or perfect being doesn't mean that perfect being exists in the external world as well. Okay? Now, some though have actually said that this criticism of Gaunilo misses the point, okay? As Anselm himself responds to it in Proslogion 3. Because God is unique in that he is a necessary being, whereas islands and other contingent things have no intrinsic maximum, such that they could always be made greater, unlike God. So the idea of God, at least according to Malcolm, and Anselm would agree as well, is logically consistent. It's perfectly possible that there's a God who is necessary, so he must exist, and he is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. Okay, he has what's called an intrinsic maximum, right? There is he is the intrinsic maximum, right? But contingent things like islands, well, they're not a coherent thing, because what is a greatest island? Couldn't I, my island have, let's say, 100 coconut trees, and let's say you don't really like coconut trees and you'd rather have some mango trees instead. How do we know which one's the perfect or the greatest island, right? So, I don't know, the greatest pizza. Some people like pineapple on pizza, some people don't. It's like, what is the greatest or the most perfect pizza, the most perfect island, for example? So these ideas, there is no such thing as a perfect pizza or a perfect island, but there is a coherent idea of a perfect God. And so, yeah, it is stupid, that you can, just because I think of a perfect island, that the perfect island exists in reality. But that logic doesn't apply to God. Anselm's going to respond, because God is unique. He is necessary, and he must exist. Okay, and he's not just a thought or something that's subjectively sort of preferred. He's different in that regard. So there is that response that some could give to Galileo's response. Okay, so it's not, don't just think that, we've got these criticisms, we've got these challenges to the ontological arguments, and then the argument's done. Right? Of course, the other side is going to respond back and say, actually, I don't think you've understood what I've said properly. Okay, so be aware there is some back and forth there, even from Anselm to Galileo. Right? He responds in Postulation 3. But many still think that Galileo effectively poked holes in Anselm's logic and showed why it is absurd. Now, there's also a lot of objections from the German philosopher Immanuel Kant. So he was an 18th century Prussian philosopher, or German, and he replied to Descartes' ontological argument mainly in his book, A Critique of Pure Reason. Okay, so remember, Descartes' ontological argument we looked at in the video 1E, Developments of the Ontological Argument, and Descartes defines God as the supremely perfect being. Okay, the thing that Kant objected to mainly was Descartes' premise that existence was a perfection. So remember, a perfection is like a maximum or the fullness of a certain attribute. So the perfection of love is omnibenevolence. Perfection of power is omnipotence. Okay, and Kant objects that existence is one of these things. Okay, because Descartes saying, well, existence is perfection, therefore God, possessing all perfections, must possess the perfection of existence. All right, but Kant is questioning this idea, and he's thinking, actually, is existence a perfection? So let's look a bit closer at Descartes' perfections. Descartes' perfections were all predicates. A predicate is a characteristic or quality that a thing can lack or possess, right? So Kant agreed that obviously certain predicates are perfections. Okay, so for example, while you could say that omniscience or omnipotence are predicates because they're characteristics or qualities that a thing can lack or possess. Okay, so those are perfections. Existence is not in that same category, right? So he's saying, okay, yeah, sure, omniscience, omnipotence, omnibenevolence, etc. Those things are all predicates. They're all characteristics that something can lack or possess. So I'll grant you that those are perfections. But existence, is that really a characteristic or a quality of a thing? Like, will we describe a thing per se as having the quality of existing, right? He doesn't think so. And so he famously remarks, existence is not a predicate, since it doesn't describe anything more about the subject, other than that it has a physical instantiation. So when we say God is all-loving, we're describing something more. We're describing a characteristic. God is all-powerful, describing something more about him, describing a characteristic. But when we say God exists, we're not saying anything more about the subject, and we're not really giving a quality of God. And so he's saying, no, actually existence isn't a predicate, and therefore it's not a perfection, right? And if it isn't perfection, and God possesses all perfections, then he doesn't necessarily possess the perfection of it, or possess existence, because existence isn't a perfection in the first place, if that makes sense. This doesn't add anything or tell us more about, God, like knowledge, power, and size of it, as we've already seen. This is because existence is not a predicate, as it says nothing about God's nature. Okay, so we've already said that. Thus, Descartes is wrong in claiming that God must possess the perfection of existence, as this is in fact not a predicate and therefore not perfection. And to further support his doctrine that existence is not a predicate, Kant gives the example of 100 thalers, which are the currency at the time in Prussia. He invites us to imagine 100 thalers and think about all of their properties. Okay, so their weight, their shape, the engravings, the colour, etc. Then imagine that these 100 thalers exist. This, according to Kant, changes nothing about the thalers themselves, and nor does it tell us anything new about them. Okay, it follows that existence cannot be a predicate, and so saying that God exists adds nothing to our concept of God, and this means that existence obviously is not a predicate, and therefore God doesn't possess this predicate or perfection, and therefore ontological arguments fail on a priori grounds, which is what Descartes is trying to do to prove God's existence. Now you could say, actually, wait, the idea of 100 thalers, if I think about it, sure, if they think about them existing, it doesn't add anything more about the thing themselves, but it's still greater because I actually have 100 thalers, before, rather than if I didn't. After than if I didn't before, right? And so you could respond to that and say, well, actually, having something in reality is greater, and maybe existence is a predicate, but it does seem pretty strong Kant's argument that existence is indeed not a predicate and therefore not a perfection. Okay, but you can evaluate for yourselves whether you think the challenges are effective or not. Thank you very much.